local history, local culture, local events, your community. This is the Joe Kelly Show.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the show. Cheryl Pula is our guest. Cheryl is a retired reference librarian, and these days she spends much of her time doing research on various topics that she writes about. She's an author and an area lecturer. We're going to be talking about some luminaries from the Civil War from our area, but before we do that, we're going to say hello. Good to see you again.
Same here. Glad to see you.
When I say luminaries, that's the topic of one of your lectures, is it not?
Yeah.
Luminary?
Yeah, it's about notable people who took part in the Civil War and maybe had an influence on the war. Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk about 2 or 3 of them that had an influence on the Civil War, including, we should start off with the most prominent luminary of them all. We've talked about him many times with Frank Tomeno and others, and that was General Daniel Butterfield. Let's start with him, then we'll get to some of the others that aren't quite so well known. General Butterfield, Medal of Honor winner.
Yes. Yes.
And he distinguished himself. Do you recall off the top of your head what battle it was?
Oh, I'm trying to remember because he did so many things during the war.
Gaines Mills.
Gaines Mills, I believe, which was part of the 7 Days battles. Yeah.
And he won the Medal of Honor, and he was as Frank Tomeno likes to say, he was a fighting general.
Yeah. He was one of the kind that wouldn't have his men do whatever he wasn't willing to do himself. He was always out there leading them. You know, he wasn't sitting behind the lines and just saying, okay, you go do this, and that he actually took part in the battles that he was in.
Yeah. And the thing he's probably most well known for today is?
Taps. Yep. He was down in Virginia, and you know, every night when it was time for the soldiers to hit the hay, as they would say, they would play a bugle call to let them know it was lights out, it was called. And he didn't particularly like that melody. So one night he's sitting there and thinking, you know, we can probably come up with something better than this. So he started tinkering around, if you will, and came up with this melody. And I've heard 2 sides of the story. One that he wrote it down, and the other says that he couldn't read music, so he called in his bugler, Oliver Norton, who came in, and Butterfield either hummed or whistled the tune for him, and Norton wrote it down because he could read music. And Butterfield told him, this is what I want you to play at night, and that way it'll signal the men it's time to bed down for the night. So Norton says, okay. So he played it, and the men liked it, and other buglers, you know, in surrounding camps heard the melody, so they came over and asked Norton for the music, and he gave it to them. And even because sound travels, the Confederates across the way heard it, and they liked it. So since they couldn't get the music, they imitated it, and it kind of became the standard lights out for both sides during the war. The original title of it was Butterfield's Lullaby, is what Norton called it. It wasn't until later that it became known as Taps. And it wasn't until, I believe, like the Spanish-American War 30 years later, when it became the standard to use at military funerals. Yeah.
I think of General Butterfield whenever I take the train to New York City, because he made his home in Cold Spring, which is on the east side of the Hudson River. He wanted to be near West Point.
I found that interesting. He has the biggest monument in the cemetery at West Point, but he didn't go to West Point, which I find kind of interesting.
Well, he loved the Army, he loved West Point, and had to get special permission to get in there because he was not a West Point graduate. And I'm trying to think, Cheryl, his wife was a Lorillard of Lorillard tobacco fame.
I believe so.
Very wealthy. He had money, but not compared to his wife, and she put up the monument. The government offered to put up a monument, but she did. Anyway, you can't miss his monument if you ever go to West Point.
No, you can't.
There's another person, though, that isn't as well known, Medal of Honor recipient, and he is buried in Forest Hill Cemetery here off of Oneida Street.
He's Charles Cleveland. He was originally from Washington County, I believe, up north of Albany. And he was a member of the Army, and was cited with the Medal of Honor, given the Medal of Honor for his actions at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862 down in Maryland. And he eventually, after the war, became police chief of Utica, New York. But during the Battle of Antietam, he was cited for saving the national colors from being captured by the Confederates. One of the most honored position in a Civil War regiment during the war was to be the color bearer, to carry the Stars and Stripes. And evidently during the battle, they were involved, and their color bearer was shot and dropped the colors. So Cleveland went forward and grabbed the flag. Now, another thing about a color bearer is, by military law, they were forbidden from carrying weapons. They had to be unarmed. So he puts down his musket, grabs the flag, and kept it from being captured by the Confederates, which was the highest honor you could do. I mean, this is a guy who now is a non-combatant because he's picked up the flag. And he saved it from being captured by the Confederates, for which he was awarded the Medal of Honor.
Yeah. You know, when I read Civil War history and I read about the colors and how much emphasis was placed on the opposing side getting the other's colors, it was just incredible what they would do to try to steal those colors.
Well, we had, we meaning Oneida County, had 3 Medal of Honor recipients in one regiment alone. That was the 146th New York, which mustered in as the 5th Oneida County Regiment. And during the Battle of Five Forks, which was the last major battle of the war in Virginia before Lee surrendered at Appomattox, in fact, Lee lost about a half of his army at that, what was left of it at that time. But the 146th had 3 Medal of Honor recipients, which no other regiment in the Union Army had during the war, that many in one regiment. And they all got it for defending the colors or capturing the other guy's colors at the Battle of Five Forks. And one of them is also buried up in Forest Hills. His name is James Grinley. So we have 2 Medal of Honor recipients in Forest Hills.
I know that Charles Cleveland's grave, because I've visited his grave over the years, I know his grave is well marked. Yeah. With a flag.
Yeah, it's got the Medal of Honor flag. It's got like a bronze plaque on the front of his headstone, and it's easy to find because it's right next to the road. That says, you know, it's a black and bronze, and it says Medal of Honor recipient with his name on it. There's also 2.
There might be a state historical marker.
I believe there is too. And there's also in front of it, you know how they have the little markers like on Memorial Day where they stick the flags in, that kind of thing. He has 2. One looks like a police shield, and it's from the Benevolent Association because he was a police chief. And the other one looks like a 5-pointed sheriff's star. They're both from the police. Okay. So it's fairly well marked. Yeah.
How about on Mr. Finley's?
Grinley?
Grinley, I'm sorry.
He's right next to the road too, but his headstone's a little smaller. And I went up there one day, this was a few years ago, when I was doing some research looking for it. I couldn't find it, so I finally said, oh, to heck with it. Yeah. And I started driving back towards the entrance when I saw this grave, again like Cleveland's, right next to the road that had a flag on it with one of those little metal holders. And I thought, well, I'll stop and see who that was. And it was him. And the holder just said Medal of Honor recipient, and then there was a flag in it. So I found him too, but he's right by the road too. So once you know where it is, it's not hard to find.
Oneida County really did more than its share in the Civil War, yes?
Oh yeah, yeah. They were in some of the really crucial battles. So we had 5 Civil War regiments, all mustered in under the name of Oneida County, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Oneida County. But then, just after the war began, they reorganized the regiments so that they were numbered not by the county, but by the state. So the 1st Oneida County Regiment became the 14th, the 14th New York. And they were instrumental in the campaign in the Peninsula, McClellan's Peninsula campaign. The 2nd Oneida County Regiment became the 26th Oneida County, and that's the one that Cleveland was in, Charles Cleveland. And they had a big part at the Battle of Antietam. Okay? The 3rd Oneida County Regiment later became the 97th New York. Most of them were from Boonville. And they played a large part in the battle, the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay? The fourth Oneida was the 117th New York. They were the only Oneida County regiment that was not attached to the Army of the Potomac up in Virginia. They were down south in North Carolina. And they were the first Union regiment into the Fort Fisher in Wilmington, North Carolina, which was the only port still left open at that time by the late war to the Confederates, so they could get supplies in from Europe. And as Sherman was marching through Georgia, the plan was to have him move up through the Carolinas, and he needed Wilmington as a resupply port. Well, they had tried to take it in December of 1864, and they couldn't do it. But they did manage to do it in January of 1865, and the 117th New York, the 4th Oneida County Regiment, was the first Union regiment into that fort. So they're credited with being the major force that helped the Union get that fort. Now, there was a second Medal of Honor winner who also became a Utica police chief. His name was Franklin Wilcox, but he was from the town of Paris, Clayville, that area. Mm-hmm. And he was in the Navy, and he took part in the battle at Fort Fisher. Okay. Mm-hmm. Then the 5th Oneida County Regiment became the 146th New York, and they played a big part in the Battle of the Wilderness, and that's where it was right after that the 3 Medal of Honor recipients got theirs for the Battle of Five Forks. And then, of course, we had General Butterfield. We had Henry Halleck from Westernville, who was President Lincoln's chief of staff during the war.
He was a general, right?
He was a general, yeah. And we had a couple admirals from Oneida County and several other politicians, Horatio Seymour, Francis Kernan, Roscoe Conkling, all who represented Utica. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we had quite an influence in the Civil War.
When we come back, we're going to talk more about that influence in the Civil War. Cheryl Pula is our guest. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Cheryl Pula is our guest. Cheryl is an area lecturer, author, and we're talking about the Civil War, luminaries from Oneida County during the Civil War. And Cheryl, one of the luminaries was in the 97th New York from Boonville, and Boonville played a big role. Actually, the ladies up in Boonville played a big role, because that outfit was very poorly at the beginning equipped.
Yes. Yeah, the ladies did a lot. They held fairs and things to raise money. They would darn socks. They would make shirts. When the regiment was raised and sent off to the war, they didn't even have the flags with them, their colors. So the ladies raised the money, and they got the flags, and they actually mailed them to them when they were down outside of Washington, waiting to be, to go off with the Army of the Potomac. So they were not well equipped. A lot of the money came from Charles Wheelock, too, who ended up as the colonel of the regiment. He took his own money. He was a grocer up in Boonville, and he gave them a lot of his own money to equip the regiment, because the government didn't just give you your uniforms and stuff for free. You had to pay for them. So a lot of the money came from him and the ladies of Boonville, who held these fairs and things and provided them with whatever they needed.
Yeah, Wheelock, Colonel Wheelock, was at Gettysburg, and
yes,
interesting character.
Yeah, he was a grocer, and he was, how shall I put this judiciously, a little overweight.
Oh, yes.
So he's like 200 pounds, something like that. But from everything I've read about him, he was a good guy.
Yeah.
He would do anything for you. But they were up to the northwest of Gettysburg on the first day of the battle, which is the direction the Confederates came in from. And it's one of the weird things about the Battle of Gettysburg was that the Northern Army came into the battle from the south and the Southern Army came in from the north.
Right.
But the 97th was up near the Lutheran Seminary, up in that area.
Seminary Ridge?
Seminary Ridge, right. And that's where some of the original Confederate attacks came through, the Chambersburg Pike and the Seminary Ridge. And they were up there with a Pennsylvania and I think a Massachusetts regiment when they were attacked by a greater number of Confederates. But they were behind a stone wall, so they managed to beat off the attack several times. And then when the Confederates were in a little bit of disarray, they decided they were going to go out and do battle. So they actually left their secure positions. They went out into the field and did battle with the Confederates and captured some flags, which was the big thing during the war. And when the word came from General Howard, who was in command of the whole army at that time, because the one who was, General Reynolds, had been killed in the battle. So O.O. Howard of the 11th Corps took over, and he said that they were going to start a withdrawal back through the town. So the 97th New York was the last federal regiment to start withdrawing back through town. A lot of people say it was a disorderly retreat, but it wasn't. It was orderly retreat. But during that retreat, Wheelock and John Spofford, who was his second in command, were taken prisoner. That's a whole interesting story. They were retreating back with their men. They got cut off, and they got surrounded near what was called the Sheeds residence, where Carrie Sheeds, who was one of the ladies in Gettysburg, had a school for girls.
Hang on to your thought just for a second. That Sheeds house still stands?
Yes, it does. Yep. And they got stuck there, and some Confederates officers came up to Wheelock and they wanted a sword. Because when you were taken prisoner, if you're an officer, you had to hand over your sword. And he said, no, I'm not going to do it. And he started arguing with them. And he basically said, look, you're traitors to your country. I'm not handing over my sword to traitors because the people in Boonville gave this to me and I'm keeping it. You're going to have to kill me to get it. So the Confederate gets distracted by something that's happening outside. And he goes and he leaves. And Carrie Sheeds, the girl in charge of the girls' school, comes up and says, give me your sword. I'll hide it. So he did. He gave it to her. She hides it under her petticoats, right?
Yeah.
The Confederate officer comes back and says, where's your sword? And Wheelock says, well, I gave it to somebody else. And he says, okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you stop and think about it, wait a minute. You wouldn't give it to me, but you'll give it to somebody else.
Yeah.
So they take Wheelock prisoner. They take Spofford prisoner. And he hid his sword in a bush. Unfortunately, the Confederates found it. And they took it prisoner, if you will. But they take Wheelock prisoner. And on the way to Libby Prison in Richmond, which is where they sent the officers, he manages to escape. Gets out of line, jumps down this hill, and he's found a few days later by some pro-Union Virginians who take him home. He gives them whatever money he has on them. They go out, they buy food, and he stays with them for about 9 or 10 days until he makes his way, they help him make his way back to Union lines. And that's how he got back to the Union lines.
Do we know what happened to the sword?
As far as I know, Carrie Sheeds had it, and she returned it. Now, unfortunately, Wheelock got ill during the war and passed away. He was in Washington, D.C. when he passed. So his body lay in state in Washington, D.C., and Carrie Sheeds heard about it, and she traveled from Gettysburg to Washington to pay her last respects. Now, Spofford, his sword was
Hang on to Spofford for a second, okay? We're going to take a break, but we'll come back. What was Spofford's rank?
He was a major.
Major. Okay, we'll come back to the major in just a second. Cheryl Pula is our guest. We're talking Civil War. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Cheryl Pula is our guest. Cheryl is an author, and she lectures on various topics around Oneida County, including the Civil War, and the Civil War is what we're talking about. The when I was in Gettysburg, we got to get to Major Spofford in a second, but you were talking about how the 97th New York was retreating in an organized manner. They were actually shooting on the main street in Gettysburg.
Oh, yes. Yep.
And you can see some remnants of that to this day.
Oh, yeah. You can see bullet holes in a lot of the buildings, like we were saying during the break, the Farnsworth House. There's an ice cream parlor just off the square in Gettysburg where there's a cannonball embedded in the side of the building.
As is the Sheets house, correct?
As is the Sheets house, right. They have some bullet holes, I believe, in the side, maybe some mini balls in there,
Yeah.
Another one is they call it the Jenny Wade house, where Jenny Wade, the only civilian, was killed. Actually, it belonged to her sister, but they call it the Jenny Wade house, and that has bullet holes in the side of it,
Major Spofford.
Yeah.
Talk about him.
John Spofford, yeah. He was with the 97th, and as they were retreating back through town, I believe he was a lawyer, if I remember correctly. They were retreating back through town, and like Wheelock, they demanded he give him the sword, and he said no, but he hid it in a bush near the house. It was found there by a Confederate soldier. I don't know the name, because they always used to refer to him as a Confederate soldier. Found it and took it as a souvenir. Well, Spofford ends up in Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. And he's passed his time whittling, and he has some little figurines and stuff that he made, because he had nothing else to do while he was there in prison except try to escape, So after the war is over, he survives, as unfortunately, as I say, Wheelock passed away, but Spofford survived. And he eventually gets his sword back because the Confederate soldier who took it as a souvenir got thinking about it and thought, well, I'd really rather give it back to the person who had it. So, of course, it had like an engraving on it, and he could trace the engraving back to Spofford, and he sends it back to him with a note saying, I found this at Gettysburg. I thought you want to have it back, and he sent it back to him. And we used to have the Dan Butterfield Civil War Roundtable here in Utica, and John Spofford's I'm not sure if it was great or great grandson was a member of that roundtable. His name was John, also Spofford. And one night when we had a meeting, we had a show and tell, and he brought Spofford's sword in to show to us, which was really, really neat.
Yeah. Up at the Oneida County History Center, they have General Butterfield's sword, and it's engraved with all kinds of things, the battles that he was at. And it was a ceremonial sword.
Right. I remember, well, most officers' swords, unless you were in the cavalry, was ceremonial. And even if you were in the cavalry, you didn't use them that often. But I remember several years ago, I think they told me at the History Center that they had a display at Arlington, I believe, of Medal of Honor recipients' memorabilia, and one of the things they loaned them was Butterfield's sword, and it was up in there in Washington for a couple of years. Yeah,
if I recall correctly, the display, it was at Arlington National Cemetery, it was in the Visitor Center, and it was on taps.
Yes.
And so they wanted to get all the information on taps they could, so they were interested in General Butterfield, and
there was a big controversy about whether he actually did taps or not. They said that some guy named Ellacombe had done it. The story is that I think his first name was supposed to be Richard Ellacombe, who was a officer in the Union Army, said that his son was a Confederate soldier who had died, and they found the music for taps in the pocket of his son's uniform. Well, they've done all kinds of research, and they have not verified that anyone with that last name fought either for the Confederacy or the Union. And Oliver Norton, Butterfield's bugler, has verified, yes, he's the one who hummed the music to me or whistled it. We wrote it down, and that's what we used.
Yeah, and I think he was from, Norton was from either Buffalo or Rochester.
Yeah, somewhere out west New York, Yeah,
Always-
I want to say Buffalo, but that could be.
Yeah, yeah.
Could be
Always
wrong.
good seeing you.
Same here.
Thanks
same
for
here.
coming in. Have
No
to
problem.
come back sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you.
That's going to do it for us this week, but we'll be back next week. We'll do it all again. Don't forget cnyhomepage.com. There's lots of good stuff there. Until next time, take care of yourself, everybody.